Welcome to our last session within the AI Cultural Sabotage series for N generation. Tonight we have our last guest, Wesley Goatley from London. Wesley, I would like to ask you to introduce yourself, please.
Hi, thanks for having me. My name is Wesley Goatley. I'm an artist and researcher based in London, as you say. And my work for the last few years has been looking at the interrelations and intersections between the AI industry, the culture industry, and the climate crisis.
Thank you very much. I would start straight with the first question, which is about one of your early pieces on these range of topics, in particular the dark age of connectionism that you realized in 2017. And there you have a set of microphones, an Amazon Echo, and a Siri device. Correct me afterwards if I'm wrong. And each new sound around the installation prompts a new question from Siri, which interrupts itself to ask new questions to the Echo if there's a new sound prompt. To listen to the questions and answers, the audience might try to stop producing any sound. This is a quite particular condition that we are not really used to, and I think that puts the audience in a quite specific mindset. So you build this artificial environment by pushing always listening devices to the extreme, I would argue. Do you think that this ultimately permeates our awareness of their perpetual listening and of feeding them content to other machines?
Yeah, I do think that that works strategy of, as you say, making people act in this very kind of unnatural way, to be so mindful of the body's most discrete sounds, like the rustling of jackets, for example, as you move. The sensitivity of that installation, which was a ring of microphones around, an Amazon Echo being suspended above a microphone that has the Siri voice in it. And as you kind of stepped into this ring of microphones, you're kind of under the audio gaze of the system. So that all of these very, very discrete sounds were picked up by that ring of microphones and contact mics on the floor for footsteps and things like that. And it was really a way of saying to the audience that there are beyond human capacities of these systems, but it's not in the magic, a magical, supposed mythical artificial intelligence. It's in the fact that these systems capture so much data sonically that might be of little interest to us in terms of what we think of as being interesting sounds. But to a company like Amazon, for example, who have such an aggressive track history of exploiting captured data to try to make any kind of meaningful sellable outcome about your life, sellable information about you captured through your browsing habits, what you're buying on Amazon, what you're watching on Amazon, all the various systems that interact with their systems or run on their backends. That to a company like that in charge of technology like this, every single sound can reveal things like, for example, multiple footsteps with enough data, you can really easily, with a circular microphone array, as is in the Echo, build something which flags at a data capture level how many people are in the room based on the amount of footsteps. If you think about an Amazon Echo often being something advertised to be in a kitchen near where someone's got two hands occupied and they're asking their Echo to order them more things from Amazon that they've run out of. It's a very good use case for that sort of technology. But you often, in a lot of countries, you get hard wipeable floors in kitchens, right? And those are also acoustically more resonant in terms of footsteps. They're not often carpeted, for example, in a kitchen, for logical reasons. And so suddenly you can start thinking about all of your body's sounds as actually being a data vector for a company like that. And so I really wanted to be illustrating how even sounds to us that are inconsequential can have meaning, and actually how difficult it is to stop yourself from producing those sorts of sounds if you're in any way living around these technologies. Hence the system, in some sense, kind of punishing you for for making those sounds, because people inevitably want to hear these strange questions being asked. And the questions that are being asked from Siri to Alexa are questions about all the things that those technologies can't answer. Questions like, how many breaks do people working in Amazon data centers get every day? And those sorts of questions we should have about these technologies, but the systems themselves aren't built to respond to. They're built to say, what time is it? What is the weather outside? And stupid, play X or Y thing. But those are the questions we should be asking of these technologies. So if audience want to hear these kind of intriguing, strange questions, they were kind of policing their own sounds. And so it was kind of like a way of in some sense, kind of forcing that sense of one's own bodily sound. And much in the same way that I feel that a work like 433 did, right? John Cage's silent piece, where it really made all the audience extremely aware. If you've ever been to a performance of that piece, you become hyper aware of the little creaks on your chair and things like that, these little sounds of your body. So I was thinking about work like that when I made that piece.
It was just coming to mind. It's kind of completely reversing the confidence that we have instead after a while of asking questions with this thing frozen, because all of a sudden we are aware of how the sound work. So from the confidence we switch in your installation to a very uneasy feeling towards the machine. Not even, I mean, for understanding somehow the logic behind, without even making any special hardware or software intervention, is it?
Exactly. And I like doing that sort of work that doesn't require a huge amount of technical knowledge in order to kind of grasp what we're talking about there. Socio-technical knowledge I'm interested in is like how these technologies impact people and interact culturally with us. You don't need to be an engineer to be able to grasp that. We all know the feeling of what an algorithmic system can make us feel in terms of doom scrolling or a dopamine loop and things like that. You don't need to be an engineer to really grasp what that means for people. And that's the sort of knowledge I'm really interested in my work.
Okay, thanks. Speaking of vocal assistants, I was wondering, isn't AI ultimately built on text as the key to attributing meanings and values to anything, also to anything oral or visual? And does this not result in the most anthropomorphic way to sell AI as intelligent? I mean, the voice. And finally, how susceptible are we to beautiful voices consistently talking to us?
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of putting it. I think, to address the first part of your question, yeah, AI systems, both from code and from things like, text labeling, are yeah heavily built on text, and to sounds and images that are tokenized rely on text and kind of labeling in a text fashion just as much as anything else does. So yeah, they very much do, and realistically you can think of everything as basically being text in a kind of AI token sense. And in terms of these questions about intelligence and the kind of beautiful voices consistently talking to us, there's some really, yeah, that's an interesting framing. During the pandemic, my work with these systems, Dark Age of Connectionism, which we were just talking about, I made in 2017, which is only a few months after the Amazon Echo came out, and it's kind of like the earlier days of this current era of AI that we're in terms of anthropomorphism being really rooted in a consumer product. That I think, that along with the tech industry and algorithmic capitalism, that was kind of like the arguably an origin point for that sort of stuff, which was my interest in that technology. And during the pandemic, my feelings about working in that space really shifted, because I came to realize that for some people who spent a lot of time in isolation during the pandemic, I spent the first 90 days of it completely on my own in a one-bedroom flat in a block of flats in South London. And for some people, the only other voice that spoke to them in their house, that acknowledged them as a person who lived, was the voice within their smart speaker or within their laptop or phone if they had something like Siri deployed on those technologies. And that's already made me think differently about the politics of care around working around these voices. I think even more so now that with in a lot of parts of the world with the twin crises of cost of living crises post 2008 financial crash, um, plus the rise in kind of mental health epidemics, basically created by a lot of different conditions. We're seeing more and more people resort to using something dumb and impersonal and cold as a large language model in place of a therapist, right? And that moment as well, I think, makes me think differently about how I critique large language models, because when I recognize that people are putting a lot of care of their and themselves through funneling them through these systems, and that's not their fault. There are these other systemic problems that create that suddenly you can't kind of quite maybe be as coldly dismissive of those technologies, and recognizing that they're playing a role. I don't like the majority of those technologies, and I think that their manufacturers are exploiting this role, and it's costing people's lives. But that they are playing a role in kind of systems of care, which I think makes us as people working with them yeah, wanting to be more careful, or really think about care as a vector through which we talk about these tools and technologies in an interesting way. And yeah, and so some people in certain conditions are much more susceptible to these beautiful voices, I think. But the manufacturers of those voices are extremely aware of that. And anybody who's interacted with a frontier large language model in the last couple of years and watched the sycophantic turn that happened around about GPT-4o way, where suddenly the system's constantly being like, what a fantastic question you've asked. It's so insightful that you've asked this brilliant question. That sort of thing is a manipulation, and is meant to exploit people who, yeah, may be susceptible to the beautiful voices, and that these companies, these are no accidents, and these companies are extremely aware that creates more engagement. And from their desperate position, they just hope it creates money, because they don't have any that is coming back in, except from speculative investments from other AI companies, and that's it.
Yeah, yeah. I'm also fascinated again that we tend to see to the visual environments as the most manipulative in general, and these systems instead use the voice, which of course is quite rich in terms of media device or medium in itself. But it's again based really on a verbal communication, which again is the primary one, possibly for us. I'm mentioning a trio of artworks that you recently exhibited, but that you have developed over the last 3 years. I'll go into details about almost each of them in subsequent question, but for the moment, you had recently exhibited Harbinger, Horizon, and Hope. And you define them, these three works, as narrative objects, which was quite fascinating for me to this specific definition, how you define them. And you said that in them, you are just connecting and implementing different announced elements of technologies without inventing new ones. Can you elaborate further on this definition of narrative objects?
Yeah, so as a brief overview of the project, these are the project's called the Horizon, the Hub, the Harbinger, the Horizon, and the Hope, and they're three different smart speaker objects, or consumer AI objects of that kind of ilk, that are set in three different plausible near futures, where different relationships that we societally have with AI have evolved in different ways. Harbinger is a future that we wouldn't want, which is tech companies moving ever closer into being inextricable from our forms of governance. In this instance, it's a desktop GP's assistant, which is always code for replacement or assumed attempted replacement, attempted automation. GP, general practitioner, doctor in the UK, One of these GP's assistant made by the company Palantir, the incredibly powerful and exploitative surveillance and military research company based in the US, heavily aligned with the US right wing. They currently have a big data sharing agreement with the NHS, the National Health Service in the UK, and this was like a desktop device that was set in a world of like, what if this relationship continues? And they offer to solve the UK's health crisis by automating GP labour. And so instead of seeing a human, you're interacting with a large language model that doesn't understand you, gets things wrong, hallucinates, which is all the best rebranding of the word failure, the best of an industry that's fantastic at branding itself. AI industry rebranding failure as hallucination was definitely the best one. And just to get a sense as an audience member of that coldness, and it was played through very kind of straight otherwise. The second piece is set in a speculative near future where resource wars, climate collapse has forced data centers to be restricted to more industrial military and governmental systems. And so everyday people no longer have access to the kind of always on AI on everything data center life that a lot of people in the global north experience right now. And was like, what happens to people when all those things are suddenly taken away? It was like an object that is somebody's trying to build an AI chatbot in a physical device by hacking together all these old devices from the 21st century, solar panels, an Amazon Echo, a Pi, a Raspberry Pi computer, and trying to make this very like low and slow sort of AI assistant out of all these kind of hacked bits of the leftover past. And then the third piece called The Hope, which was a very a hopeful project for me of thinking, well, what's a potential future where we might totally change our understanding of what these technologies really are and do. And it was based around the notion of the device being reframed as AI stands for assistive interface rather than artificial intelligence. And what would a kind of like a smart home type device look like if we didn't expect it to be alive? We didn't expect it to be clever. We didn't expect it to automate things for us, but instead to be an assistive interface, a tool that's meant to assist things that we're doing. So in terms of this notion of a narrative object, because each of them were really embedded within these fictions, and the way that I'd written, all three of them involve large language models to different in different amounts of it. And I use all locally hosted, meaning that they run on small private computers on device rather than in the cloud, because I don't believe that using data centers in my line of work is responsible or ethical. Not in terms of work that is public facing within a gallery context. Obviously, I still have to use Google like everybody else, but I try to restrict that usage in my artworks. And so these narrative objects were large language model driven with a huge amount of work that I put into kind of writing and editing their back end code in a sense, their system prompt for anybody listening who's more aware of those sorts of technologies. Basically ways for you to kind of like write new realities from which the large language model drags its responses from when prompted by an audience member. And so there's actually a lot of speculative fiction that I wrote that's a kind of in a machine readable format that is inherent to all three of the objects, but not visible to the audience. But it comes out through questions they might ask the device, and the device responds back by kind of pulling from this fiction that I wrote through for each one. So it's quite a lot of fleshing out. So there's a lot of narrative, and the object is there as a new way of embodying, enacting, and performing that narrative with some degree of generativity based on how those systems are always probabilistic in the way that they generate text.
Okay, thanks. I had a couple of questions about hope in particular. Not, I mean, equally fascinating as the other two, but it's resonating. They were resonating something that you already mentioned. The first one was about the local dimension that you pushed there. And then if the, reducing the concept of AI to a local dimension, it's somehow fighting against the corporate model, which is instead universal. and behind the curtains, not that much anymore, probably, highly polluting. So is it also a conceptual fight between the universal model and the local model, which is actually the one that we would mostly need?
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot myself in my work of thinking about what's an ethical use of these technologies within a critical arts practice. Um, and again, as I was talking about just now, for one thing, I don't use API like web-based data center heavy artworks, which would, every single time an audience interacted with them would be using a lot of resources in a data center somewhere elsewhere on the planet. I don't, I just don't, I can't really, wouldn't be able to stand in front of my own work and say that this deserves to be out here if I was also contributing in that way to, yeah, these huge and incredibly climatically impactful and fragile technological infrastructures that the AI bubble is built upon. And so that's one of the reasons why uh, I'm only using them within the context of local hosting. So taking again, running large language models and similar technologies directly on device that's in the artwork itself, bypassing the need after you download the model, you could just bypass the need entirely to use any data centers in that operation. Now, yeah, and that has the advantages of then my audience's interaction with those technologies aren't also doing training for companies that I may well be critiquing through the work, right? If I was trying to critique OpenAI's technologies by using their APIs in the gallery, no matter how critical or well-meaning that critique, my audience would still be implicated then very meaningfully within those systems of exploitation and would be quite literally, feeding their data to those companies. And so actually, when I see galleries using these tools visibly in their works, I always think that that's a really unethical way to engage with your audience as well. And there should be warnings on the door to say about that sort of thing. But I do think that these are effective ways of at least saying that or acknowledging that there are many uses for these tools which people can find are super valuable in their lives. Things like large language models have got some domain specific uses, and there is a bunch of different tools out there that use these technologies or the basics of these technologies, not necessarily the exact products that OpenAI peddle, for example, but things within that suite of technologies not made by them. There's plenty of those that we could have that could work really well and be really useful for us and that we could trust. And I come from an intellectual background that would see technologies as never being good nor bad nor neutral. There being no such thing as an inherently good, bad, or neutral technology. It's simply how it's being used by a human at any one point, what it's been designed for, and who maintains those technologies. So it always keeps us rooted back in the human rather than the technological. That's just how I view these things. And so I'm really thinking about, well, what's my role as an artist then? Me as the human wielding these things, how do I find, if I'm committed to that intellectual position, how do I find what I can think in this instance to be a good use of this technology? If otherwise, it would be very easy for me to say, all AI is bad, let's smash all of it. That's a very seductive view for me because I am a Luddite in the sense that I believe that certain technologies should be smashed for the good of all workers. I don't think that's not a very dramatic position, I don't think, and is a very reasonable one in regards to some of these tools. But that doesn't mean that I reject them entirely, and I find them compelling. And like many digital artists, even critical digital artists like myself working in this space, we don't necessarily hate technology. We're inevitably in this game because we actually are very intrigued by technologies and tools, and we grew up around them, and we were all nerds and played a lot of video games and things like that. And we are just that sort of person. But it means that we're always looking for ways to engage with these things in a way that doesn't conflict with our own ethics as well.
Yeah, and then this with all these considerations about the role of technology and how it plays, and ethical perspectives on it, shouldn't I would push a little bit on the scale again. So, um, there has been attempt in the past to push the local scale of technologies, like the LAN, the local area network versus the global internet. Not as a refusal of it, but as a moment where the dimension of there means more than the dimension of everywhere, potentially. And the infrastructure is somehow built instead for the everywhere, every time. So the here or there, I mean, let's say the here and the here and now, giving value to it, especially when it comes to sophisticated technologies, switches or shifts, let's say, the level of engagement of users, especially if they are not alone, as you were mentioning, for example, in the pandemic, which I think has changed, as you were also elaborating, the feeling of ourselves somehow in the world for a luckily relatively short period of time. So pushing the local dimension and immanent time isn't, as you are doing with some of this project, isn't also inherently claiming back the infrastructure. So to say, and I mean, you also, in one of these projects, you also mentioned the mesh networks that it uses, which also means here or close to here rather than everywhere. What do you think about it?
Absolutely. And I think that using, because also putting them here materializes them directly in front of you, because inevitably then the system that's running it is physically right there, as opposed to the abstraction of the cloud, which obviously a lot of people are really confused by, and they are kept at distant from the materiality of that in the sense of the data center that runs it. So I think that there's a materiality that comes inherently to that, and there's a fragility inherent to that as well, of placing it in front of you, seeing how small these things can be, for example. And there's also a bit of friction. I like the frictional aspect. As I was talking about the second project, the horizon, meaning the kind of possible near future, and it's one that we can kind of see coming. Is one which is the second work of the three I was just talking about. That piece specifically is also taking a kind of low and slow AI approach of a chat interface that you can see the physical processes of fans spinning up in preparing a response from the large language model, for example. And you can see there's a battery meter that as you interact with the system, the battery's slowly running down to the point where when it gets to zero, the whole system will switch itself off. And so you're very much grounded that this is a short-term interaction you have with this system to ask it questions or chat with it or whatever you want to do with those technologies. And I like that fragility, and I like grounding it in that form of materiality, because I think it reframes and reminds us that in spite of, if you close your eyes and picture AI, most people will picture a blue brain floating in space, or zeros and ones floating down a screen, or the white male hand touching a white plastic robot finger like that. Everyone has these, and anybody watching this has seen these and know exactly what it is. But if you think about a picture of AI, most people don't picture a laptop, which is a far more reasonable image to pick of an AI, of what AI is. And so actually there's a lot in the cultural unconscious about that does good work, I think, to ground it in the local and to talk about things like mesh networks, which are existing technologies we've already got, local area networks, sharing of computational resources between local devices. These are all technologies that we already have, and that already, as you said in your previous question, that they use these things all use existing frameworks that I was interested in kind of bringing back together in one place for these works.
Yeah, I'm going to quote you with something that seems to relate very closely to it. In a previous interview, you said there is not just a single AI future, this kind of shiny silver and glass utopia we get sold. And you added futures that cannot involve AI do not need to be impoverished futures. So for the first part, I would like to ask you, there is also an aesthetic that is sold together with the concept and the technology as well. What you define shiny, silver, and glass. And it's utopia. Why you use the term utopia here? It's something that it's sold as a value of the product, or it's something that we, how can I say, anthropologically aim to reach, and we hope to find in this kind of product.
Yeah, and again, I find it easy to talk about that because I know that if I ask the audience to close their eyes and picture a successful technological future, I can tell you exactly what you're picturing. You're picturing blue sky, green grass, big shiny silver and glass towers, maybe some robots milling around cleaning things, probably no humans because there's very rarely are there humans in there because humans are messy and they're not as clean as that image. And if you again go to something like Google image search and Google image search future utopia, it's always a technological future in that sense. It's always got some advanced technology, flying cars, automated vehicles, that sort of thing. But it's always blue sky, green grass, the shiny silver and glass towers, suggesting this kind of like future. And I think that tech companies are really promising that. And say tech companies in a very global sense because we see evidence of this all over the world where there is like a particular peak around technological development and the futures associated with that, which includes the US, India, China, and Europe. That they're often selling this vision of the basically saying, if you give us basically everything, the world's resources, all the money, freedom from laws like copyright and things like that, all the things that they are regularly asking for. We want more investment from it than any company has ever had in history. We want more power in both senses than any company has had in history. You know, we want to be closer to power. That we will deliver this future because you know what the other future is. The other future is probably, for most people, the climate crisis. And I feel that in terms of media landscapes, those are the two futures that get presented. It's either climate crisis or some sort of collapse, whether or not that's a zombie apocalypse or else. And then this techno utopia. What I've been interested in is that even the techno utopias are, no one can believe them unless they're in some sense fake or only for a few people. And so many science fiction films of the last few years show that, and I think that's really kind of revealing. So so those that's that kind of nature of the shiny silver and glass utopia, because obviously there is no such thing as a utopia, but I think those images of them present them as being frictionless and permanent in a way that I was just talking about in introducing friction and fragility as actually being really useful tools in critical discourse.
Yes, I'm hit a bit by this term frictionless. This is exactly uh, what the imaginary, I would say, about sophisticated technologies is about. There is nothing that really goes, that makes any kind of conceptual, physical friction somehow.
Mm.
And I would like to pick up another work of yours, The Listener, which is maybe the most technical work from those I've seen you have made. The technical in terms that really goes in analyzing a specific characteristic of devices that are trying to connect to each other. And it's based on the device's exchange with other devices in order to maintain connection. And I would say also of being as fast as possible in doing that, which is something that we unawarely are asking somehow all the time. We get lost if our devices are not connected because most of the services and information sometimes quite vital information, the timing of the flight, of the train we have to catch, or the if we have to face particular weather conditions or not, are all there thanks to some exchange of data. So you expose actually here what you call personal forms of data from these devices, which is, if I'm not mistaken, the very specific unique number of each device, the MAC address, and the last networks it was connected with, which we might consider very intimate data for our personal devices. So how much do you think this indicates our attitude and trust, especially in delegating to technology while having so little control over it as a society? I mean, generally speaking, there has been this increasing phase where technological companies has absolutely proven to be much faster than any possible law enforcement, any possible government law. But at the same time, we still have this trust and we still have this attitude to delegate this to them, all of that to them. So what do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the listener was talking specifically about the Wi-Fi protocol and how it was designed, which is obviously a very everyday technology, but the history of which is not always super clear to people who rely upon it every day. And I was really drawing attention to the IEEE, which is the kind of oversight organization who maintained the protocol and kind of developed it, and things like their close relationship to the military industrial complex in the US, for example, having former generals, serving as their heads and things like this. But then, all around the world, there is a close relationship between the tech industry and the military industry. But with the IEEE being a largely US-based institution, there was something there as well. And it was, so the work was sort of highlighting how the way this particular protocol was designed, not the way that the internet has to work, and not the only way that the devices have to work, but the way that it was designed and that we do use, works in this way that, from some perspective, personal user data is not prioritized as being as important, its privacy, that is, as being important as the rapidity of its function. And there's something there, which is why your phone is kind of like constantly broadcasting, I'm here, are you one of these networks? Because I'm looking for these networks because my job is to connect to these networks to anthropomorphize the phone, which sounds as stupid as it should do. And that's why you shouldn't anthropomorphize AI systems either, because it's silly, but in doing so, it is broadcasting a list of recent SSIDs or like network names that you've connected to, which could, for some people, crazily put their own address as their network name, which is kind of madness. But it can show what school you go to, what coffee shop you regularly go to, et cetera, et cetera. And so there is that there about how a lot of these hidden protocols have have been decided to work in this fashion. But much like Dark Age of Connectionism and a lot of my other work, that it's really saying that these are just one way these technologies have been made, and we don't need to have them in this way. Again, the Hope was a project that was saying that if we thought about these technologies differently, we can still keep what we find useful about them, but the versions that are served to us by technology companies are not the only ones. We're just kind of tricked into believing that's the case, that if you want this technology, it has to be in this box, which has got a set of design logics and an ideology behind it that basically pushes for the kind of worst possible outcome for that technology, in effect. But I think what you say is interesting about legislation being much slower than innovation in the West. I think it's very interesting to look at China for that, because obviously Chinese relationship between the tech industry and the government is very, very different and much, much closer, and that things don't happen largely without government oversight, partially because also there's, kind of funding considerations around that, but also think what you want about the Chinese government, but it does have a very explicit, considers itself to have explicit remit for care for its citizens, and it's made it very, very clear in its past that it does not consider runaway of innovation from tech companies that it knows does not have its citizens' best interests at heart as being the route towards this sense of whatever communist ideal they are currently holding on to, which at least shows that there is a different way of doing this. I wouldn't want that to be what we have, because I think there are other concessions there politically which I personally wouldn't want to make. But I interact with Chinese nationals enough to know that it doesn't make you a bad person or something to come from a system like that, any less so than I would judge an American for having been born in the US because of how I view their system, right? A state is not its people. But I do think that there is kind of lessons to learn to remind ourselves, something that we often don't do in the West, to remind ourselves that there are other models of governance that are just possible. We might not necessarily want those, but I think it's good to remember that there are other relationships towards technology and governance that we could have, and that some of those already function in the world. And even if we don't want those ones, it still reminds us there is the capacity to ask for more, much in the same way there's a capacity to ask for an AI technology that you don't feel exploits you or talks down to you or is doing all the things we don't want AI technologies to do.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Let me pick up another work of yours. You published this spoken word digital album, if I might define it like that, called Newly Forgotten Technologies, Stories from AI-Free Futures. Would you define it as a privileged view from after an AI collapse? Because I mean, listening to the narrative that you use, there's always this looking a little bit back, but describing a series of phenomena that are among these we are fearing mostly about AI. And did you want to offer a conceptual alternative with it to the industry-touted inevitability of AI in the future with this particular work?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted a literal alternative. I wanted to really articulate what alternatives could be. So in the work, it's a series of short fiction pieces, in effect, with spoken words, spoken by synthesized voices, with a soundtrack that I compose that is composed itself from those dissected and malformed voices. And yeah, in it, I'm talking about different possible stories about different possible futures after AI in some sense. And some of those are futures we might want, some of those are futures we might want to avoid. Some of them are based around climate collapse, making all of that pointless. Some of them are talking about a kind of a runaway innovation, much like we were just talking about, making all of what seems now seem much tamer by comparison. And then some of them are just people getting bored of the lies and the manipulation of their emotions, manipulation of their hopes and fears for the future. I think that there's only so much tolerance that people can stand. And I think we see so much manipulation, quite unified in its visions internationally. We see so much manipulation of an expectation of the future, as I was saying earlier, of there basically being two futures: the shiny silver and glass fake AI utopia, or the climate collapse. And I really wanted to talk about all the futures that could be, or just some of the futures that could be in between those two. And that's a critical gesture from my perspective, just to remind people, not to play the prediction game as people in foresight or speculation often do, where they say, I think this will be the future. I'm somehow a soothsayer, but I've got no interest in playing that role, and I think it's a silly thing to do. It's a silly thing to claim a computer can see the future, as silly as it is to claim that a human can, in my position. But just to say that if we can imagine these futures being plausible, and it was a lot of my work to make those fictions feel very realistic, which is why they're so grounded in, each of them are very grounded in human responses, human emotions. None of them talk about a magical AI apocalypse where all the machines become sentient, or whatever other silly fictions the AI industry tries to scare us with, like children at Halloween. It's because it's the day before Halloween that I'm thinking about that. But was really to say, if you can imagine these happening, then that's just some of the many futures we can imagine happening that aren't these two polars. And that we can think, well, then what other things might be possible? And it's hopefully an invitation for the audience to think, well, what other stories can I imagine being functional. If I just think, well, actually, we can just really look to history to some degree to teach us how we respond to technical innovation or various political crises, et cetera, et cetera. All of this has happened before and will happen again. And that was where that work was really grounded in, was really not wanting to sugarcoat it and just say everything's going to be fine or everything's going to be terrible, but instead say there are many different options and we do have a capacity to will some of those into being, or at least demand them. And that voice has yet been taken from us.
Let me finish with one specific concept that you were mentioning in the track, A Final AI Winter. There you talk about AI summers and AI winters. Can you elaborate a bit further on that?
Yeah, so these are terms taken from the history of AI, which is a field that is arguably 75, 80 years old, which a lot of people don't really realize. They think of it as being very new, but most of the algorithms that are very popular today are at least 40 years old at this point. And arguably the space is not very innovative right now at all. But the AI summers and winters are terms to basically describe kind of AI bubbles and their pops. So the AI industry is really inherent of over-promising and under-delivering, and its history is full of these. And they're called AI summers, where they're times where you can get funding for saying you're doing AI research. And generally speaking, from militaries around the world, where you say we're going to do AI research, we're going to make a machine that is like a human, and then the military will go, great, so it can drive a tank. And they go, yeah, sure. They can drive a tank. And they go, great, great. 5 years later, loads of investment. They've got a bad chatbot. Again, the history of like one-dimensional chatbots, that are just one-dimensional chatbots and are not alive. And then they lose that funding. And suddenly, if you say you're doing AI research, no one wants to touch you with a barge pole, to use a very English phrase, I just realized. No one wants to get near you. No one would certainly give you any investment money because they've had their fingers burned. And then you go into an AI winter where everyone has to rebrand, and they rebrand to call things like informatics or strategic business management systems, and then start to use terms like neural networks, but don't call it AI yet. And arguably, there's a lot around the rise of machine learning that was happening at a time when arguably we were yet to reach this particular AI summer we're in now, where machine learning arguably was a way of kind of gently sidestepping some of the negative associations with AI. It does have other definitions to that, and there is some meaningful use of it within the field, but I think wider use of it was potentially around those things, because we also see AI bubbles popping in relation to sci-fi. As much as the AI industry relies upon sci-fi to articulate its future because it only exists within science fiction, people, after big sci-fi films come out that are really damaging to the reputation of AI, we do see an issue with investment. Terminator 2 was one of them. You can map these interesting correlations between certain people getting funding and losing funding based on those narratives as well, and which is where speculation and science fiction is so wrapped up in the myth of AI. And so I was really with that work, the piece A Final AI Winter, as you were talking about, one of the tracks on the album. It was like, what happens when there's no more summer that comes afterwards? What happens when whatever happened in that last summer, things have gotten so bad that there is no next summer, that people have just in that particular story, people have gotten so sick of that particular narrative, those people would never be allowed back in again because of the scale of the promise in the previous summer, that this time they actually gotten so big, made so many promises, and so many people suffered because of those promises. It's effectively set directly after the current summer we're in, that they got so sick of it that the term AI just would not shake its poisonous historical mantle anymore, and those companies really had to move away from it.
Yeah, or could maybe there would be a slow and different summer that would then be reappropriated by the real needs and the communities that will build or tame somehow their own infrastructure in order to evolve this concept on a different, smaller scale somehow.
Absolutely, and that's why all my work centers people, because I know that that's where I feel that power truly lies still, that the tech industry again and governmental shifts have not yet taken that from us. And so all of the works we talked about today and everything that I continue to do really centers about our responsibility, our bodies, our knowledge, our actions, our inactions, not in a punitive way. I don't want people just to feel bad about themselves about not knowing about this stuff or not necessarily caring about it. But I just want people to realize that their thoughts about it do matter and that their opinions change how they act. And I want that to be grounded in the work continually moving forward, because the worst thing we can do is assume that this is the only way that things can be.
Okay, perfect conclusions for this interview. Thanks a lot, Wesley, for your really inspiring and insightful answers about your work. Thanks again.
Thank you.